Picture this. You're sitting in your warm, comfortable home right now, maybe with a cup of coffee in your hand. You feel safe, protected. But what if I told you that at this very moment, somewhere in the world, brave men and women are facing impossible odds, surrounded by enemies who want them dead? What if I told you that sometimes, just sometimes, one person's courage can mean the difference between 250 families getting their loved ones back home, or receiving folded flags instead? This isn't a Hollywood movie. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of Lieutenant Colonel Joe Jackson, a Navy helicopter pilot, who faced a choice that would define not just his own legacy, but the fate of 250 U.S. Marines trapped in what many considered a suicide mission. When everyone else said it couldn't be done, when military commanders shook their heads and called it impossible, Jackson looked at those odds and said two simple words: "I'm going." What happened next would become one of the most daring rescue missions in military history. But it started with something much simpler and much more terrifying. A radio call that would change everything. The morning of January 21st, 1968, dawned grey and cold over the remote hills of South Vietnam. For the 6,000 Marines stationed at Cu San Combat Base, it was supposed to be just another day in what had already been a brutal tour of duty. They were positioned at one of the most isolated and dangerous outposts in the entire Vietnam War, a strategic hilltop base that controlled key supply routes near the border with North Vietnam. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez was cleaning his rifle when the first mortar round exploded. The blast knocked him flat against the sandbags, his ears ringing, dirt and debris raining down on his helmet. Before he could even process what was happening, the ground beneath him seemed to erupt in a symphony of destruction that would last for the next 77 days. But Mike and his fellow Marines had no idea that this was just the beginning. They didn't know that 40,000 North Vietnamese Army soldiers had been quietly positioning themselves in the hills around their base for weeks. They didn't know that this wasn't just another attack. It was the opening move of what would become known as the Siege of Khe Sanh, one of the longest and most brutal battles of the entire Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese had chosen their target well. Khe Sanh wasn't just any military base, it was a symbol. If they could overrun it, if they could eliminate the Marines stationed there, it would be a devastating blow to American morale and a powerful propaganda victory. The base sat on a plateau surrounded by mountains, making it nearly impossible to defend and even harder to escape from if things went wrong. And things were about to go very, very wrong. Within hours of that first mortar attack, Khe Sanh was completely cut off from the outside world. The North Vietnamese had severed all ground supply routes, making it impossible for trucks or ground reinforcements to reach the besieged Marines. The only airstrip at the base came under such intense enemy fire that landing became a death sentence for any pilot brave enough to attempt it. Captain James Wilson, the base communications officer, found himself in the unenviable position of having to report their situation to command headquarters in Da Nang. His voice was steady, professional, but those who knew him could hear the underlying tension as he spoke into his radio handset. Da Nang base, this is Khe Sanh. We are taking heavy incoming fire from all directions. Estimate enemy strength at division level, possibly higher. Our perimeter is under constant attack. Request immediate air support and reinforcement. He paused, listening to the static-filled response, then added the words that would echo through military command centers across Vietnam. Be advised, we are effectively surrounded and cut off. Situation critical. The response from Da Nang was swift but not encouraging. Air support would be provided when possible, but weather conditions over the mountains were deteriorating rapidly. Thick monsoon clouds were rolling in, making air operations extremely dangerous. As for ground reinforcements, that was simply out of the question. The roads leading to Khe Sanh were now completely controlled by enemy forces. The Marines were on their own. As night fell on that first day, the true horror of their situation began to sink in. The enemy bombardment continued relentlessly, with mortar rounds and rockets falling on the base every few minutes. The Marines huddled in their bunkers, reinforced with sandbags and whatever materials they could find. But everyone knew these fortifications wouldn't hold up against a sustained assault by 40,000 enemy soldiers. Corporal Danny Martinez was sharing a bunker with 5 other Marines when a rocket-propelled grenade exploded just outside their position. The concussion wave knocked all of them unconscious for several minutes. When Danny came to, his ears were bleeding and he couldn't hear anything except a high-pitched ringing. He looked around at his fellow Marines, boys really, most of them not even 20 years old, and saw the same expression on every face. Fear. Not the kind of fear you feel watching a horror movie, but the deep, primal fear that comes when you realize you might not live to see another sunrise. But along with that fear was something else, something that would sustain them through the nightmare to come. It was the unshakable bond between Marines, the knowledge that they would fight for each other no matter what the odds. They were brothers, and brothers don't leave brothers behind. The siege had begun, and it would test every limit of human endurance and courage. The impossible situation develops. By the end of the first week, the situation at Khorasan had gone from bad to absolutely desperate. The constant bombardment had destroyed most of the base's above-ground structures, forcing the Marines to live like moles in underground bunkers and trenches. Food supplies were running dangerously low, medical supplies were nearly exhausted, and ammunition was being rationed. But the worst part wasn't the physical hardships, it was the psychological warfare. The North Vietnamese had positioned loudspeakers in the hills around the base, and throughout the night they would broadcast messages intended to demoralize the trapped Marines. Sometimes it was propaganda about the futility of the American war effort. Sometimes it was fake radio traffic claiming that the base had been abandoned by command and that no rescue was coming. And sometimes, most terrifyingly, it was the recorded screams and pleas of captured American prisoners. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, one of only 3 Navy nurses stationed at the base's medical facility, found herself working 20-hour days treating wounded Marines in conditions that would have challenged surgeons in fully equipped hospitals. Her medical bunker, constructed from sandbags and corrugated metal, was lit by a single generator-powered bulb that flickered constantly. She had run out of proper surgical instruments days ago and was now using mess hall knives sterilized over candle flames to perform life-saving operations. The hardest part wasn't the lack of equipment, she would later recall. It was looking into the eyes of these young men and trying to give them hope when I wasn't sure I believed it myself. They would ask me if rescue was coming, if they were going to make it home to see their families again. What do you tell a 19-year-old kid who's been shot in the stomach when you're not even sure you're going to survive the next hour? The Marines had organized themselves into a defensive perimeter, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time before the North Vietnamese launched their final assault. Intelligence reports suggested that the enemy was massing for a coordinated attack that would overwhelm the base's defenses through sheer numbers. The Americans were outnumbered nearly 7-1, and they were running out of everything they needed to fight. Colonel David Murphy, the base commander, was a 25-year Marine veteran who had seen action in Korea and multiple tours in Vietnam. But even he had never faced a situation like this. Every night he would walk the perimeter, talking to his Marines, trying to keep their spirits up while privately calculating their odds of survival. The numbers weren't encouraging. "Command keeps telling us to hold our position," he confided to his executive officer during one of their nightly planning sessions. "But hold it with what? We're down to less than a week's worth of ammunition, half our men are wounded, and every day we lose more good Marines to that damn artillery." The executive officer, Major Robert Kim, spread out a hand-drawn map of their defensive positions on the bunker table. Red marks indicated where they had lost ground to enemy infiltration. Blue marks showed where their own defenses had been compromised by bombardment. There were far too many red marks and not nearly enough blue ones. "Sir, I've been thinking," Major Kim said carefully. "Maybe it's time we consider alternatives to staying put. If we could break out in small groups, move at night, some of our people might make it to the coast." Colonel Murphy shook his head grimly. "And leave our wounded behind? Leave our brothers to die? That's not how Marines do business, Major. We came here together, and we are leaving together. All of us, or none of us." It was a noble sentiment. But privately, both men knew that all of us was becoming increasingly unlikely with each passing day. The monsoon rains that had been threatening finally arrived during the second week of the siege, turning the base into a muddy quagmire and making air support virtually impossible. The thick cloud cover meant that even if rescue aircraft could navigate the treacherous mountain terrain, they wouldn't be able to see the base until they were practically on top of it, well within range of the enemy's surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns. Sergeant First Class Maria Gonzalez, a communications specialist, spent her days hunched over radio equipment in a bunker barely large enough for 2 people, desperately trying to maintain contact with the outside world. The constant bombardment had damaged their main radio antenna 3 times, and each repair mission meant sending Marines out into the killing zone above ground. "Da Nang Base, this is Khe-san," she would call out over and over, adjusting frequencies and amplification settings, trying to punch a signal through the atmospheric interference caused by the storm. "We need immediate evacuation. Repeat, we need immediate evacuation. Our situation is untenable." The responses, when they came at all, were always the same. Weather was too bad for helicopter operations. Ground routes were still blocked. Air Force transport planes couldn't land under these conditions. Hold your position, reinforcements are being planned. But Maria had been a communications specialist long enough to read between the lines. The pauses before responses came back were getting longer. The voices on the other end were starting to sound less confident, more resigned. She was beginning to suspect that the people in the command centers were no longer planning a rescue. They were planning a memorial service. The call for a miracle. 3 weeks into the siege, with ammunition running critically low and medical supplies nearly exhausted, Colonel Murphy made the most difficult decision of his military career. He ordered his communications team to send out a general distress call to all American units in the area. Not a formal request through military channels, but an open plea for help from anyone, anywhere, who might be able to respond. The message was simple and heartbreaking. This is Khe-San Combat Base. We have 250 Marines trapped and under siege. Conventional rescue is not possible due to weather and enemy positioning. We are requesting volunteer pilots for emergency evacuation. This is likely a one-way mission. Repeat, this is likely a one-way mission. The message went out over both military and emergency frequencies, broadcasting into the stormy night across the mountains of South Vietnam. Most military commanders who received it filed it away, as another tragic casualty report in the making. The weather was simply too bad, the enemy presence too strong, the risks too high. Sending aircraft into that situation would only result in more casualties, not fewer. But in a small Navy air facility 50 miles away, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Jackson was finishing his evening patrol when that distress call crackled through his radio. Jackson was a helicopter pilot with over 15 years of experience, a veteran of multiple combat tours who had earned a reputation for taking on missions that other pilots considered impossible. He was also a man haunted by a promise he had made to himself early in his military career, that he would never leave fellow servicemen behind if there was anything at all he could do about it. Jackson pulled his helicopter into a hover pattern and called his crew over the intercom. "Did you guys copy that transmission from Khe-San?" His co-pilot, Lieutenant Mark Thompson, responded immediately.
"Yes, sir."
"Sounds like they're in serious trouble up there. Weather report shows 0 visibility, sustained winds at 40 knots, with gusts up to 60, added Sergeant Carlos Rivera, the crew chief. Mountain terrain, enemy SAMs, heavy anti-aircraft fire. No one's getting through that, Colonel." Jackson was quiet for a long moment, studying the weather readouts on his instrument panel. Every rational part of his mind agreed with his crew's assessment. This wasn't just dangerous. It was suicidal. The chances of successfully reaching Khe-San, loading wounded Marines, and getting back out alive were virtually 0. But then he thought about those 250 Marines huddled in their bunkers, listening to enemy propaganda broadcasts, telling them they had been abandoned. He thought about young men, boys really, who had volunteered to serve their country, and who now faced the prospect of dying alone in a muddy hole thousands of miles from home. "Sergeant Rivera," he said finally, "how much fuel do we have?"
"Enough for about 4 hours of flight time, sir."
"Best route you can find through those mountains." There was a pause before Thompson responded. "Sir, with respect, are you sure about this? Command hasn't authorized any rescue missions. This could be considered disobeying direct orders." Jackson smiled grimly as he adjusted his flight controls and began turning toward the mountains. "Sometimes, Lieutenant, doing the right thing and following orders aren't the same thing. Those Marines need help, and we're the only ones crazy enough to try. Besides," he added with a dark chuckle, "they can't court-martial us if we don't make it back." As they climbed into the stormy night sky, heading toward what everyone else had written off as certain death, Jackson keyed his radio one more time. "Khe-San Base, this is Navy helicopter, Yankee 77. We're en route to your position. ETA approximately 90 minutes. Prepare your wounded for immediate evacuation." The response came back immediately, filled with static but unmistakably emotional. "Yankee 77. This is Khe-San. Are you serious? Are you actually coming?" "Roger that, Khe-San. Marines don't leave Marines behind. We're coming to get you." In his bunker 50 miles away, Colonel Murphy put down the radio handset and closed his eyes. For the first time in 3 weeks, he allowed himself to hope. Not much, he was too experienced a soldier to believe in miracles. But maybe, just maybe, they weren't going to die on this godforsaken hilltop after all. Outside, the storm raged on, and in the distance, enemy artillery continued to fall on American positions. But somewhere in that chaos, a single helicopter was fighting its way through mountain winds and monsoon rains, carrying 3 men who had decided that some things were worth risking everything for. The rescue attempt was about to begin. Lieutenant Colonel Joe Jackson had flown through bad weather before, but nothing had prepared him for what he encountered as his helicopter climbed into the mountain passes leading to Kisan. The wind hit them like an invisible fist, sending the aircraft lurching sideways so violently that for a moment Jackson thought they might actually flip over. Rain hammered against the windscreen with such force that the wipers could barely keep up, and visibility dropped to less than 50 feet. "Jesus Christ," muttered Lieutenant Thompson, gripping his control stick so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "Colonel, I can barely see the instrument panel, let alone navigate through these mountains." Jackson fought to keep the helicopter stable as another massive gust of wind tried to slam them into the mountainside. The aircraft's engines were straining against the storm, and he could feel the machine shuddering under the stress. Every instinct he had developed over 15 years of flying was screaming at him to turn around, to find a safe place to land and wait for better weather. But then the radio crackled with another transmission from Kherson, and Jackson heard something in the voice that made his blood run cold. It wasn't just desperation anymore, it was resignation. These Marines were starting to accept that they were going to die. Any aircraft, this is Kusan Base. We are taking heavy casualties. Medical supplies exhausted. Request immediate medevac for 17 critical wounded. If anyone is out there, please respond." Jackson keyed his radio without hesitation. "Kherson, this is Yankee, 7-7. Still en route. What's your current situation?" The response came back immediately, and Jackson could hear the surprise and hope in the Marine's voice. "Yankee, 7-7, you're still coming? Sir, we've been taking incoming fire all night. Enemy forces have moved closer to our perimeter. Our landing zone is under direct observation. Anyone trying to land here is going to take heavy fire." Sergeant Rivera, monitoring the enemy radio frequencies, looked up from his equipment with a grim expression. "Colonel, I'm picking up North Vietnamese communications. Sounds like they're coordinating something big. I think they're planning a final assault." Jackson processed this information quickly. Not only were they flying into impossible weather conditions, but they were heading straight into what was likely going to be the climactic battle of the siege. Every rational calculation said they should abort the mission. But Jackson had made his decision, and he wasn't backing down. "How much further to Khe Sanh?" he asked Thompson. "About 20 miles, sir." "But Colonel, at our current speed in these conditions, that's still 45 minutes of flight time. And I'm not even sure we can find the base in this weather." Jackson adjusted their heading slightly, following a narrow valley that cut between two mountain peaks. The helicopter was being buffeted constantly by crosswinds, and several times they came dangerously close to the rocky walls on either side. But this route would take them around the heaviest enemy anti-aircraft positions, giving them at least a small chance of reaching Khe Sanh alive. "Khe Sanh, this is Yankee 7-7, Jackson called over the radio. "We need you to guide us in. Can you provide navigation assistance?" "Roger, Yankee. 7-7. We'll do what we can. Be advised, we're going to have to mark the landing zone with flares, but that's going to draw enemy fire. The moment those flares go up, every gun in the area is going to zero in on our position." Jackson smiled grimly. These Marines were willing to paint a target on themselves just to help him find them in the dark. It was exactly the kind of courage he had come to expect from the Corps, but it still amazed him every time he saw it. "Understood, Khe Sanh. Light 'em up when you hear our engines. We'll get in fast and get out faster." As they continued through the mountain passes, the true scope of what they were attempting began to sink in. Even if they managed to reach Khe Sanh safely, landing in a hot zone under enemy fire was only half the challenge. They would need to load wounded Marines while under direct attack, then take off again through the same terrible weather that had nearly killed them on the way in. And that was assuming the North Vietnamese didn't shoot them down the moment they appeared over the base. Lieutenant Thompson was studying his navigation charts by the dim red light of the cockpit, trying to plot their exact position using dead reckoning and the few landmarks he could occasionally glimpse through the storm. "Colonel, I think I see some light up ahead. Could be the base." Jackson squinted through the rain-streaked windscreen and saw what Thompson was referring to. A faint orange glow, emanating from somewhere in the valley ahead. But as they got closer, he realized it wasn't the warm light of a military base. It was fire. Something at Khe Sanh was burning. Hell on earth. The scene that greeted Jackson as they finally approached Khe Sanh was like something from a nightmare. The entire combat base was under intense bombardment, with explosions erupting across the compound every few seconds. Several buildings were on fire, sending pillars of black smoke into the stormy sky. Tracer rounds from machine guns crisscrossed the area like deadly fireworks, and the distinctive sound of incoming mortars could be heard even over the noise of their helicopter engines. "My God," whispered Thompson. How is anyone still alive down there? Jackson activated his radio to contact the base, but before he could speak, the voice of the Marine ground controller came through, shouting over the sound of nearby explosions.
Yankee 77, Yankee 77.
Thank God you made it. But sir, you need to know, the enemy just started a major assault. They're hitting us from all sides. Our landing zone is taking direct fire. I don't know if we can get you in safely. Jackson could see muzzle flashes in the hills surrounding the base, indicating that North Vietnamese forces had moved much closer than anyone had expected. The Marines were completely surrounded, fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. Landing in the middle of this battle would be like flying into a meat grinder, but those 17 wounded Marines weren't going to survive much longer without medical evacuation. Some of them were probably dying right now, lying in makeshift medical bunkers while enemy shells fell around them. Jackson had come this far. He wasn't turning back now. Khe-san, we're coming in. Have your wounded ready for immediate transport. We're not going to be able to stay on the ground very long. Roger, Yankee, 7-7. Wounded are staged in bunkers near the landing zone. But sir, I have to tell you, the moment we light those flares, every enemy gun in the area is going to open up on us. Are you sure about this? Jackson looked at his crew, giving them one last chance to object. Lieutenant Thompson nodded grimly. Sergeant Rivera checked his weapon and gave a thumbs up. They had come this far together. They were going to see it through together. Light the flares, Khe-san. We're coming in hot. What happened next would be burned into Jackson's memory for the rest of his life. The moment the first flare ignited on the ground below, the entire hillside around Khe Sanh erupted in gunfire. Machine guns, rifles, mortars, and rocket-propelled grenades all opened up simultaneously, turning the night into a deadly light show. Bullets began hitting their helicopter immediately, punching through the thin aluminum skin and ricocheting around the cabin. "We're taking hits," shouted Rivera. "Multiple impacts on the fuselage." Jackson threw the helicopter into a steep dive, dropping toward the landing zone as fast as he dared while enemy tracers streaked past on all sides. The aircraft was shuddering from bullet impacts, and warning lights were beginning to flash on the instrument panel. But the engines were still running, and the controls were still responding. They had a chance. The landing zone was nothing more than a small clearing surrounded by sandbag fortifications, barely large enough for one helicopter. As Jackson brought the aircraft down, he could see Marines running through the chaos, carrying wounded comrades toward the helicopter on makeshift stretchers. Some of the Marines were wounded themselves, but still helping to evacuate their brothers. The helicopter touched down hard, bouncing once before settling onto the muddy ground. Immediately, enemy fire intensified, with bullets whining off the aircraft's rotor blades and sparking against the metal fuselage. Jackson kept the engines running at full power, ready to lift off the moment they had loaded the wounded. "Go, go, go," he shouted to his crew as Rivera threw open the side door and began helping the Marines load their casualties. What Jackson saw in that moment would haunt him forever. The wounded Marines being carried to his helicopter weren't just injured, they were devastating casualties of prolonged combat. Some had lost limbs to mortar rounds. Others had massive burns from incendiary weapons. Several were unconscious from blood loss or traumatic brain injuries. But every one of them was being carried by fellow Marines who refused to leave them behind, even in the middle of a pitched battle. Corpsman 3rd Class Jennifer Walsh was one of the Navy medical personnel helping to load the wounded. She had been at Khe Sanh for the entire siege, working around the clock to keep Marines alive with limited supplies and equipment. As she helped lift a critically wounded Marine into the helicopter, a mortar round exploded less than 30 feet away, showering them all with dirt and shrapnel. "This one's got internal injuries," she shouted to Rivera over the noise of gunfire and rotor blades. "He needs surgery within the hour or he's not going to make it." Rivera nodded and helped secure the wounded Marine in the cabin. They were loading the casualties as fast as humanly possible, but enemy fire was getting more accurate by the second. Jackson could see North Vietnamese soldiers moving closer to the landing zone, trying to get within range for a direct assault on the helicopter. Race against death. As the last of the critically wounded Marines was loaded into the helicopter, Jackson realized they had a problem. The aircraft was now severely overloaded. Between the wounded, their medical attendants, and the crew, they were carrying nearly twice the recommended payload for their helicopter model. Combined with the battle damage they had already sustained and the terrible weather conditions, getting airborne was going to be a challenge. "Colonel, we're way overweight," Thompson called out, studying the aircraft's performance gauges. "And we're still taking hits. I don't think we can maintain altitude in these conditions." Jackson made a quick decision that probably saved all their lives. Instead of trying to climb straight up out of the landing zone, he kept the helicopter low, skimming just above the treetops as they flew away from Khe-Sanh. This made them a more difficult target for the enemy gunners in the hills, but it also meant flying blind through mountain terrain in a damaged aircraft during a violent storm. For the next 20 minutes, Jackson flew what was essentially a controlled crash through the Vietnamese mountains. The overloaded helicopter struggled to maintain altitude, dropping dangerously close to the ground several times. Warning lights continued to flash on the instrument panel, indicating damage to critical systems. And all the while, they could hear the wounded Marines in the cabin, some crying out in pain, others ominously silent. Corpsman Walsh worked frantically to keep the most critically injured Marines alive during the flight. With no proper medical equipment and limited supplies, she was essentially performing field surgery in the back of a bouncing helicopter, while enemy territory flashed past below them. "I'm losing this one," she called out about one Marine who had taken shrapnel to the chest. "His blood pressure is dropping fast." Rivera, who had basic medical training, moved to help her while Jackson fought to keep the aircraft stable. The Marine in question was barely 19 years old, a kid from Iowa who had been drafted into the Corps straight out of high school. He was unconscious, pale from blood loss, and Walsh couldn't seem to stop the bleeding from his chest wound. "Come on, kid," Rivera muttered, applying pressure to the wound while Walsh prepared an IV line. "Stay with us. We didn't come all this way to lose you now." Meanwhile, Jackson was dealing with increasingly serious mechanical problems. The helicopter's tail rotor had taken several bullet hits, making the aircraft difficult to control. The main engine was running rough, possibly damaged by shrapnel, and their fuel supply was dropping faster than it should have been, indicating a leak somewhere in the system. "How far to the nearest medical facility?" he called back to his crew. "Da Nang Air Base has a field hospital," Thompson replied, checking his charts. "About 30 miles southeast." "But Colonel, I'm not sure we can make it that far. We're losing altitude, and our fuel consumption is way too high." Jackson did some quick calculations in his head. 30 miles in their current condition would take at least 25 minutes of flight time. They might have enough fuel, but only if nothing else went wrong. And in their experience, something always went wrong. "Da Nang Base, this is Navy Helicopter Yankee 77 requesting emergency landing clearance." He called over the radio. "We have 17 wounded Marines aboard, several critical. We are a damaged aircraft with mechanical problems. Request priority medical response." The response came back immediately. "Yankee 77, this is Da Nang Base. You are cleared for emergency landing on any runway. Medical teams are standing by. What is your ETA?" "Approximately 20 minutes, assuming we can maintain current airspeed." There was a pause, then, "Yankee 77, be advised that weather conditions at Da Nang are marginal. Heavy rain, low visibility, crosswinds at 30 knots. Are you capable of instrument landing approach?" Jackson looked at his damaged instrument panel, with half the gauges either not working or showing erratic readings. He looked back at the wounded Marines, some of whom were clearly dying despite Walsh's heroic efforts to save them. He looked at his crew, who had volunteered for what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission. "Da Nang, we'll be capable of whatever we need to be capable of. Those Marines need medical attention now." Against all odds, the final approach to Da Nang Air Base was a nightmare of precision flying under impossible conditions. The storm that had made their mission to Khe-Sanh so difficult was still raging, and Jackson was trying to land a severely damaged helicopter in crosswinds that was strong enough to flip a healthy aircraft. To make matters worse, the Marine they had been trying to save during the flight had gone into cardiac arrest. Walsh was performing CPR in the back of the helicopter, while Rivera assisted her. But without proper equipment, their options were extremely limited. "I can't get a pulse," Walsh called out, continuing chest compressions on the young Marine. "We need to get him to a trauma surgeon right now." Jackson pushed their damaged engines to the limit, coaxing every bit of speed he could get from the struggling aircraft. The engine temperature gauges were well into the red zone, indicating that they were probably causing permanent damage to the machinery. But machinery could be replaced. The lives of those Marines could not. "Da Nang, this is Yankee 77 on final approach. We have one Marine in cardiac arrest. We need medical personnel standing by at the landing pad." "Roger, Yankee 77, medical teams are in position. You are cleared to land on helipad 2. Emergency vehicles are standing by." As the lights of Da Nang Air Base appeared through the rain and darkness, Jackson felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion wash over him. They had done it. Against all odds, through impossible weather and enemy fire, they had managed to rescue 17 wounded Marines from certain death. But he knew the mission wasn't over until every one of those Marines was safely in the hands of medical professionals. The landing was rough but successful. The moment their wheels touched the ground, medical teams swarmed the helicopter, carefully removing the wounded Marines and rushing them to the base hospital. Walsh continued performing CPR on the Marine who had suffered cardiac arrest, running alongside the stretcher as they carried him to the emergency room. Jackson shut down the engines and sat back in his pilot's seat, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. His hands were shaking from adrenaline, and his ears were ringing from hours of engine noise and gunfire. Lieutenant Thompson was slumped in his co-pilot's seat, looking like he had aged 10 years in the past few hours. "Colonel," Rivera called from the back of the helicopter. "You need to see this." Jackson climbed out of his seat and walked back to the passenger compartment. What he saw there drove home the reality of what they had just experienced. The entire cabin was riddled with bullet holes. Seats were torn apart by shrapnel. Blood stained the floor and walls. It was a miracle that any of them had survived the mission, let alone all of them. "Sir," Rivera said quietly, "I count over 40 bullet holes in this aircraft, any one of those could have hit a critical system or killed someone. How the hell did we make it through that?" Jackson didn't have an answer. Skill had certainly played a part, but so had luck, and the incredible courage of everyone involved. The Marines at Khe Sanh who had risked their lives to mark the landing zone. His crew who had volunteered for a suicide mission. The medical personnel who had worked miracles with minimal equipment. Everyone had done their job under impossible circumstances. A few minutes later, a Navy medical officer approached Jackson with an update on the wounded Marines they had rescued. 16 of the 17 were going to survive, thanks to their quick evacuation to proper medical facilities. The Marine who had suffered cardiac arrest during the flight was still in critical condition, but doctors were optimistic about his chances. "Colonel," the medical officer said, "I want you to know that without your rescue mission, every one of these Marines would have died. The ones with internal injuries wouldn't have lasted another hour. You saved 17 lives tonight." But Jackson knew the mission wasn't complete. There were still over 230 Marines trapped at Khe Sanh, still under siege, still facing the same desperate situation they had left behind. The North Vietnamese assault was continuing, and those Marines needed help just as badly as the ones they had just rescued. "Doctor, how long will it take to get this helicopter repaired?" Jackson asked. The medical officer looked at him in disbelief. "Colonel, that aircraft took more damage than should be survivable. It's going to need major repairs, possibly weeks of work. You can't seriously be thinking of flying it again." Jackson looked back at the bullet-riddled helicopter, then up at the storm clouds still raging over the mountains where his fellow Americans were fighting for their lives. "Doctor, there are still Marines at Khe Sanh who need our help. We didn't come this far to leave the job half-finished." Lieutenant Colonel Joe Jackson stood in the maintenance hangar at Da Nang Air Base, staring at his bullet-riddled helicopter while rain drummed against the metal roof. Chief Petty Officer Mike Santos, the base's senior aircraft mechanic, was shaking his head as he examined the extensive damage from their rescue mission to Khe Sanh. "Colonel, I've been working on aircraft for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like this," Santos said, running his hand along a line of bullet holes that stretched from the nose to the tail boom. "The fact that you made it back at all is nothing short of miraculous. But flying this bird again? That's going to take at least 2 weeks of major repairs, assuming we can even find all the parts we need." Jackson knew Santos was right, but every hour they waited meant more Marines were dying at Khe Sanh. The intelligence reports coming in were getting worse by the hour. The North Vietnamese had intensified their assault after the helicopter evacuation, apparently realizing that American forces were trying to rescue the trapped Marines. Radio communications with the base were becoming increasingly sporadic, and several Marine positions had gone silent completely. "Chief, what if we don't worry about making her pretty?" Jackson asked, studying the damage assessment report. "What if we just focus on the systems we absolutely need to fly? Engines, flight controls, basic navigation. How long would that take?" Santos looked at him incredulously. "Sir, that's still talking about at least 48 hours of round-the-clock work. And even then, I wouldn't want to fly that aircraft in good weather, let alone back into combat conditions. One more hit in the wrong place, and she'll go down like a stone." Jackson was weighing his options when Lieutenant Thompson appeared in the hangar doorway, still wearing his flight suit from their previous mission. His face was grim, and Jackson could tell immediately that something had happened. "Colonel, we just got word from Khe Sanh," Thompson said. "The situation has deteriorated significantly. The enemy overran the northeastern section of the perimeter about 2 hours ago. Estimated Marine casualties are mounting. Command is considering other options." Jackson felt his blood run cold. In military terminology, other options usually meant preparing to abandon a position that could no longer be defended. It meant accepting that some Marines were going to be left behind. How many wounded are still at the base? Jackson asked. Latest count is 37 Marines requiring immediate medical evacuation, plus an unknown number of additional casualties from the recent fighting. But, sir, Command has made it clear that no further rescue missions are authorized. The risks are considered too high. Jackson walked over to a workbench and picked up the preliminary damage report on his helicopter. 43 bullet holes, damaged tail rotor, engine problems, fuel leak, hydraulic system compromised. By any rational assessment, attempting another mission would be suicide. But then he thought about those 37 wounded Marines lying in makeshift medical bunkers while enemy artillery fell around them. He thought about 19-year-old kids from small towns across America, boys who had volunteered to serve their country and who now faced the prospect of dying alone and forgotten in a muddy hole thousands of miles from home. Chief Santos, Jackson said quietly, if you had to make this helicopter flyable for just one more mission, not safe, not pretty, but flyable, how long would that take? Santos studied Jackson's face for a long moment, recognizing the determination he saw there. He had seen that same look on other pilots' faces over the years, usually right before they did something incredibly brave and incredibly stupid. Colonel, if we strip out everything non-essential, patch the worst holes, and pray to every deity known to mankind, maybe 12 hours. But I want to be clear, this would be a one-way trip. The chances of that aircraft making it back from another mission are essentially zero. Jackson nodded slowly. He had expected as much. But sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting that you might not come back. Those Marines at Kaisan had accepted that risk when they volunteered for military service. Now it was his turn. Get started on those repairs, Chief, and see if you can find me a volunteer crew. I won't order anyone to come with me on this one. Volunteers for a suicide mission. Word of Jackson's planned return to Kaisan spread through the base quickly, despite efforts to keep it quiet. By evening, Jackson had more volunteers than he could possibly use. Pilots, crew chiefs, medics, even ground personnel who had no business being on a combat aircraft. Everyone wanted to be part of the mission to rescue their fellow Marines. Lieutenant Thompson was the first to volunteer, despite having already risked his life once on the previous mission. Sir, if you're going back, I'm going with you. We started this together, and we're going to finish it together. Sergeant Rivera was equally determined. Colonel, those Marines are counting on us. I've already been shot at once today. What's one more time going to hurt? But Jackson knew this mission would be different from their first trip to Kaisan. The element of surprise was gone. The North Vietnamese would be watching for rescue helicopters, and they would have moved additional anti-aircraft weapons into position around the base. The weather was still terrible, but enemy defenses would be even worse. Hospital Corpsman First Class Amanda Rodriguez approached Jackson as he was reviewing intelligence reports about enemy positions around Kaisan. She was a Navy medic with extensive trauma experience, exactly the kind of person they would need if they were going to evacuate seriously wounded Marines. Colonel, I'd like to volunteer for your mission, she said without preamble. I heard you're planning another evacuation run to Kaisan.
Jackson looked up from his maps.
Corpsman, this isn't going to be like a normal medical evacuation. We're going into a hot combat zone in a damaged aircraft. The chances of survival are not good. Rodriguez smiled grimly. Sir, I didn't join the Navy to stay safe. Those Marines at Kaisan need medical attention, and I'm the best trauma medic available. If you're going, I should be going with you. As Jackson assembled his volunteer crew, he received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Robert Hayes, the base commander at Da Nang, appeared in the maintenance hangar where they were working on the helicopter repairs. Jackson, I need to talk to you, Hayes said, his expression serious. Walk with me. They stepped outside into the rain, away from the other personnel working on the aircraft. Hayes lit a cigarette and studied Jackson's face in the dim light from the hangar. Joe, I've been getting calls from command about your little unauthorized rescue operation, Hayes said. Some people are very unhappy that you went to Kaisan without proper authorization. Others think you should get a medal. But everyone agrees that you're not going back. Jackson had been expecting this conversation. Military bureaucracy moves slowly, but it always caught up eventually. Sir, there are 37 wounded Marines at that base who are going to die if someone doesn't get them out. Command may have written them off, but I haven't. Hayes took a long drag on his cigarette. Jackson, I understand your feelings. Hell, I admire them. But sending you back to Kaisan in that damaged aircraft would be sending you to your death. And I can't authorize that, no matter how noble your intentions. Then don't authorize it, Jackson replied. I'm not asking for official approval. I'm asking you to look the other way for about 6 hours while we finish these repairs and launch one more mission. Hayes stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. You know what you're asking me to do? You're asking me to let you commit suicide and to be complicit in it. Those Marines at Shisan are probably dead already. Intelligence suggests the base may have been overrun. Then we go find out for sure. And if there are survivors, we get them out. Hayes finished his cigarette and flicked the butt into a puddle. Jackson, I've known you for 8 years. You're one of the best pilots I've ever worked with, and one of the most stubborn human beings I've ever met. If I order you not to go, you'll probably try to steal an aircraft and go anyway. Jackson said nothing, which was answer enough. All right, Hayes said finally. I'm going to go to my office and work on some paperwork. I probably won't be back to check on aircraft maintenance until tomorrow morning. What happens between now and then is out of my direct knowledge. Jackson smiled, for the first time in hours. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. Bring those Marines home, Jackson. All of them, including yourself. The final mission. At 0300 hours, 12 hours after their first rescue mission, Jackson's makeshift crew climbed aboard the hastily repaired helicopter for what everyone knew would likely be their final flight. The aircraft looked like something from a junkyard, patched with metal plates, held together with wire and prayer, systems jury-rigged to provide basic functionality. Chief Santos had worked miracles during the night, but even he wasn't confident about the aircraft's reliability. Colonel, I've done everything I can, but this bird is held together with duct tape and determination. The slightest additional damage could cause catastrophic failure. The crew consisted of Jackson and Thompson in the cockpit, Rivera as crew chief, Rodriguez as medical officer, and 2 additional Navy corpsmen who had volunteered for the mission. 6 people risking their lives to save 37 they had never met. As they lifted off from Da Nang in the pre-dawn darkness, Jackson keyed his radio to contact Khe-san. The response was immediate but weak, the signal fading in and out through heavy static. Yankee. 7. This is Khe-san. Thank God you're coming back. Situation critical. Enemy has breached perimeter in multiple locations. We have wounded trapped in forward bunkers. Need immediate evacuation. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by static. Jackson tried several more times to re-establish contact but got no response. Either their radio equipment had been damaged by enemy fire, or there was no one left alive to answer. The flight to Khe-san took 90 minutes through continuing bad weather, but this time Jackson knew what to expect from the mountain terrain. The helicopter performed adequately despite the extensive battle damage, though several systems showed signs of stress that worried both pilots. Colonel, engine temperature is running hot, Thompson reported, and we're getting intermittent warnings from the hydraulic system. How long can we maintain current performance? Jackson asked. Hard to say, sir. Maybe another hour, maybe 5 minutes. This aircraft is really pushing its limits. As they approached the valley where Khe-san was located, Jackson could see that the situation had changed dramatically since their previous visit. The entire area was lit up by fires and explosions, indicating that the battle was still raging intensely. But there was something different about the pattern of gunfire. It seemed more concentrated, more focused on specific areas of the base. Khe-san, this is Yankee. 7-7 requesting landing instructions, Jackson called over the radio. This time, a response came back immediately, but it was from a different voice than before, younger, more desperate. Yankee, 7-7, this is Private First Class Williams. I think I'm the senior radio operator left. Sir, most of our command staff has been killed or wounded. We've lost contact with several sections of the perimeter, but we still have wounded who need evacuation. Can you really get us out of here? Jackson felt his heart sink. The situation at Khe-san was even worse than intelligence reports had suggested, but hearing that young Marine's voice, full of hope despite the desperate circumstances, strengthened his resolve. Private Williams, we're here to get your wounded out. What's your current tactical situation? Sir, the enemy has overrun about half the base. We're holding the central area and the original landing zone, but it's taking constant fire. We have 23 wounded Marines staged for evacuation, but several more are trapped in forward positions that we can't reach. Jackson made a quick decision. They would make multiple trips if necessary, using different landing zones to avoid concentrating enemy fire. It would be dangerous, but it was the only way to get all the wounded Marines out. Private Williams, prepare your first group of wounded for evacuation. We'll be over the landing zone in 3 minutes. Heroes don't count the cost. The landing zone at Khe-san was chaos incarnate. Enemy mortar rounds were falling every few seconds, sending up geysers of mud and shrapnel. Machine gun fire swept across the area in deadly arcs, forcing the defending Marines to stay low in their bunkers. And through it all, wounded Marines were being carried toward the helicopter landing zone by their fellow soldiers who refused to leave anyone behind. Jackson brought the helicopter down fast and hard, not bothering with a gentle approach. The moment their wheels touched the muddy ground, Rodriguez and the other medical personnel were out the door, helping to load the most critically wounded Marines. "This one's got multiple fractures and internal bleeding," Rodriguez called out as they loaded a Marine who couldn't have been more than 18 years old. "He needs surgery immediately." Rivera was coordinating the loading process while keeping watch for incoming enemy fire. "Colonel, we're taking some hits, but nothing critical yet. How many can we take on this trip?" Jackson did quick calculations based on aircraft performance and weight limitations. 8 wounded maximum plus medical personnel. Any more than that and we won't be able to maintain altitude. As they loaded the wounded Marines, Jackson could see the incredible courage of the defenders. Marines who were wounded themselves were helping to carry their more seriously injured comrades. Others were providing covering fire, exposing themselves to enemy bullets to protect the evacuation. It was the kind of selfless heroism that defined the Marine Corps at its best. Private Williams, the young radio operator, appeared at Jackson's cockpit window. He was covered in dirt and blood, and his left arm was in a makeshift sling, but he was still functioning as the base's communications coordinator. "Sir, we've got 8 critical wounded loaded. But there's something else. We have 14 Marines trapped in a forward bunker about 200 meters from here. They've been cut off since yesterday, and several of them are wounded. We can't reach them because of enemy fire." Jackson looked toward the area Williams indicated and could see muzzle flashes from what appeared to be an isolated Marine position. They were completely surrounded by North Vietnamese forces, but were still fighting. "Private, can those Marines move to an alternate pickup point if we provide covering fire?" "Sir, I don't think so. 2 of them can't walk, and the others won't leave them behind. If we're going to get them out, we'll have to land right next to their position." Jackson studied the tactical situation quickly. Landing near the trapped Marines would require flying directly over enemy positions, taking his helicopter into the most dangerous area of the battlefield. With their aircraft already damaged and performing marginally, it would be an enormous risk. But 14 Marines were counting on them. "All right, Private. We'll take this load of wounded back to Da Nang, then come back for the trapped Marines. Can your people hold out for another 2 hours?" Williams nodded grimly. "We'll hold, sir. Marines don't quit." The flight back to Da Nang was tense but successful, despite increasing mechanical problems with the helicopter. 2 of the rescued Marines went into cardiac arrest during the flight, but Rodriguez and her medical team managed to stabilize them using heroic efforts under impossible conditions. But as they landed at Da Nang, Jackson received devastating news. Intelligence reports indicated that North Vietnamese forces had launched a final assault on Khe Sanh. Radio contact with the base had been lost completely. The fate of the remaining Marines was unknown. Against all odds, Chief Santos took one look at the helicopter as it landed at Da Nang and immediately began shaking his head. The aircraft had taken additional damage during the second mission to Khe Sanh, and several critical systems were now operating far below normal parameters. "Colonel, this helicopter is not going to make another flight," Santos said bluntly. "The engine temperature spiked during your approach, indicating possible internal damage. The hydraulic system is leaking fluid faster than we can replace it, and I count at least 15 new bullet holes that weren't there this morning." Jackson climbed out of the pilot's seat, his body aching from hours of flying under combat conditions. He was exhausted, but the thought of those 14 Marines trapped in a forward bunker at Khe Sanh wouldn't leave his mind. "Chief, what would it take to get this bird airworthy for one more flight?" "Colonel, I'm not even sure it's safe to start the engines again, let alone fly combat missions. You're talking about mechanical systems that are operating well beyond their design limits." Thompson approached Jackson with the latest intelligence report from Khe Sanh. His expression was grim, and Jackson could tell the news wasn't good. "Sir, satellite imagery shows heavy enemy activity around the base. It looks like the North Vietnamese have moved additional forces into the area, and we've had no radio contact for the past 30 minutes. Jackson studied the intelligence photos, trying to determine whether the Marines were still holding their positions or if the base had been completely overrun. The images were inconclusive, but they showed extensive damage to many of the Marine defensive positions. "Lieutenant, in your professional opinion, what are the chances that Marines are still alive at Khe Sanh?" Thompson was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sir, honestly, based on the intelligence we're seeing, the odds aren't good. The enemy had overwhelming numerical superiority, and our people were running low on ammunition and supplies. But you said chances, not certainties. There's still a possibility that Marines are alive and need our help. It's possible. Jackson made his decision. Chief Santos, I need you to make this helicopter fly one more time. I don't care if you have to rebuild it from spare parts. Those 14 Marines are counting on us. Santos looked at the battle-damaged aircraft, then at Jackson's determined face, then back at the helicopter. Finally, he sighed and called for his maintenance crew. All right, Colonel, we'll give it our best shot. But I want it on record that this is the craziest thing I've ever been asked to do in 23 years of aircraft maintenance. For the next 6 hours, Santos and his team worked miracles of improvisation and determination.
Whoa.
They patched holes, replaced damaged components with parts cannibalized from other aircraft, and jury-rig systems that had no business working under combat conditions. When they were finished, the helicopter looked like something assembled in a junkyard, but it was technically flyable. As Jackson prepared for what everyone knew would be his final mission, he was approached by Colonel Hayes, the base commander. Jackson, I've been monitoring the situation at Keshan. Latest intelligence suggests the base may have fallen. You could be flying into a trap. Sir, until we know for certain that those Marines are dead, we have an obligation to try to rescue them. Hayes studied Jackson's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I understand. But Joe, if this mission goes bad, if that helicopter goes down, there won't be any rescue mission for you. We can't risk any more aircraft on what may already be a lost cause. I understand, sir. Hayes extended his hand to Jackson. Then Godspeed, Colonel. Bring our Marines home. The last flight, at 1800 hours. As the sun was setting over the mountains of South Vietnam, Lieutenant Colonel Joe Jackson climbed into his patched-together helicopter for what would be the most dangerous mission of his military career. The aircraft was held together with determination, spare parts, and what Santos had described as mechanical prayer. His crew consisted of the same volunteers who had risked their lives on the previous missions: Lieutenant Thompson, Sergeant Rivera, and Corpsman Rodriguez. They had all been given multiple opportunities to withdraw from the mission, but none of them had taken it. Gentlemen, lady, Jackson said over the intercom as they lifted off from Da Nang, I want you to know that flying with you has been the greatest honor of my career. Whatever happens in the next few hours, I'm proud to serve alongside each of you. The flight to Khe Sanh took place in ominous silence. Radio attempts to contact the Marine base went unanswered. Intelligence updates suggested increasing enemy activity in the area, and the helicopter's mechanical systems continued to show signs of stress that worried everyone aboard. Colonel, engine temperature is climbing again, Thompson reported. We may not have much time once we reach the target area. We go in fast, load whoever we can find, and get out immediately. As they approached the valley where Khe Sanh was located, Jackson could see that the tactical situation had changed dramatically. The base was dark, with no visible signs of American activity. Fires were still burning in several locations, but there was no organized defensive fire, no radio communications, no indication that Marines were still fighting. It looks deserted, Rivera observed from his position at the door gun. Maybe the base was evacuated. But Jackson had a different interpretation of what he was seeing. The lack of visible activity could mean the base had fallen, but it could also mean the surviving Marines were lying low, hiding from enemy forces while waiting for rescue. Khe Sanh Base, this is Yankee. 7-7 requesting immediate response. Jackson called over the radio. For long seconds, there was no answer. Then, faintly, a voice came through the static. Yankee, 7-7. This is Khe Sanh. We're still here, 14 Marines in Bunker 7. Need immediate evacuation, enemy all around us. Jackson felt a surge of relief and determination. The Marines were still alive, still fighting, still hoping for rescue. He wasn't too late. Khe Sanh, we're coming to get you. Prepare for emergency extraction. The landing zone near Bunker 7 was a nightmare of tactical complexity. It was surrounded by enemy positions under direct observation, and barely large enough for a helicopter. Approaching it would require flying directly over North Vietnamese gun positions, and landing would make them a stationary target for every enemy weapon in the area. But those 14 Marines had been holding that position for more than 24 hours, fighting against overwhelming odds, waiting for rescue that many people had assumed would never come. Jackson began his approach to the bunker, and immediately the helicopter came under intense enemy fire. Tracers streaked past on all sides. Bullets punched through the aircraft's thin skin, and the sound of incoming rounds hitting metal was constant. "Taking multiple hits," Rivera called out. "But we're still flying." As the helicopter settled onto the muddy ground next to the bunker, Marines began emerging from their defensive positions. Some were wounded and had to be carried by their comrades. Others provided covering fire, engaging enemy positions with their remaining ammunition. The loading process took less than 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. Enemy fire was constant and accurate, with several rounds passing within inches of the helicopter's vital systems. But the Marines moved with incredible efficiency, loading their wounded first, then the walking wounded, then the able-bodied defenders. Sergeant First Class Robert Kim, the senior Marine at the bunker position, was the last aboard. He had been wounded in the leg, but had continued to command his Marines throughout the siege. "Sir," he said to Jackson as he climbed aboard, "I don't know how you found us, but 14 Marine families are going to be very grateful." Jackson smiled grimly as he applied power for takeoff. "Sergeant, Marines don't leave Marines behind. That's not how we do business." The takeoff from Bunker 7 was the most harrowing moment of Jackson's flying career. The overloaded helicopters struggled to gain altitude while enemy fire continued from all directions. Warning lights flashed on the instrument panel, indicating critical damage to multiple systems. The engine temperature gauge was well into the red zone, suggesting imminent mechanical failure. But somehow, impossibly, the aircraft continued to fly. They climbed slowly away from Khe Sanh, carrying the last Marines to be rescued from what had been one of the most desperate sieges in American military history. 15 minutes into the flight back to Da Nang, the helicopter's engine finally succumbed to the damage it had sustained. Warning lights lit up the cockpit like a Christmas tree, and Jackson could feel the aircraft beginning to lose power. "We're going to have to make an emergency landing," he announced to his crew. "Everyone prepare for a hard impact." Jackson managed to guide the failing helicopter to a small clearing in the jungle, where they made a controlled crash that left everyone shaken but alive. Within an hour, rescue helicopters from Da Nang had located them and evacuated everyone to safety. Heroes come home. The final tally of Lieutenant Colonel Joe Jackson's unauthorized rescue missions was extraordinary. 31 Marines evacuated from certain death at Khe Sanh, with every single one surviving their injuries, thanks to prompt medical treatment. The missions had been accomplished using a helicopter that should have been grounded after the first enemy hit, flown by a crew that had volunteered for what everyone knew was likely a suicide mission. When Jackson and his crew finally made it back to Da Nang, they were greeted as heroes by their fellow servicemen, but Jackson himself was characteristically modest about their accomplishments. "We just did our job," he told the crowd of personnel who had gathered to welcome them back. "Those Marines at Khe Sanh did the hard part. They held their positions and kept fighting when most people would have given up. All we did was provide transportation." The story of Jackson's heroic rescue mission spread quickly through the military and eventually reached the highest levels of government. President Lyndon Johnson personally presented Jackson with the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It was the letters he received from the families of the Marines he had rescued. It was learning that Corporal Martinez had recovered from his injuries and returned to his family in Texas. It was hearing that Private Williams had been promoted and was serving as a helicopter crew chief himself. Most of all, it was the knowledge that when his fellow Americans had needed help, when conventional military wisdom said rescue was impossible, he had found a way to make it happen. 30 years later, at a reunion of Khe Sanh veterans, Jackson was approached by a middle-aged man with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes. The man extended his hand with a smile. "Colonel Jackson? I'm Robert Martinez. You probably don't remember me, but you saved my life in Vietnam. I was 19 years old, scared out of my mind, convinced I was going to die in that bunker. You and your crew risked everything to come get us." Jackson shook the man's hand warmly. "I remember you, Robert. How have you been?" "Good, sir. Really good. I've got 3 kids, 2 grandchildren, and a successful construction business in Texas. None of that would have been possible without what you did. I just wanted to say thank you." Jackson smiled, feeling the same emotion he had experienced 30 years earlier when he first heard those desperate radio calls from Khe Sanh. "Robert, you don't need to thank me. That's what we do for each other. Marines don't leave Marines behind." As the reunion continued around them, with stories being shared and old friendships renewed, Jackson reflected on the choices that had brought them all to this moment. The choice to volunteer for a dangerous mission. The choice to risk everything for fellow Americans in trouble. The choice to believe that some things were worth any sacrifice. In the end, That's what heroism really was. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to do the right thing despite the fear. It was ordinary people making extraordinary choices when the situation demanded it, and sometimes, when you made those choices, miracles happened. Sometimes, against all odds and in defiance of conventional wisdom, you could actually save the day. The Marines who had been trapped at Khe Sanh were living proof of that truth.
They had gone on to live full lives, raise families, build careers, and contribute to their communities. All because one Navy helicopter pilot had looked at an impossible situation and decided that impossible was just another word for challenging.
The siege of Khe Sanh had lasted 77 days and had tested every limit of human courage and endurance.
But in the end, the Marines had held their ground, the rescue missions had succeeded, and every American who could be saved had been brought home safely. It was a reminder that heroes aren't born, they're made. In moments of crisis, when ordinary people decide to do extraordinary things for their fellow human beings. And sometimes, just sometimes, that makes all the difference in the world.